So at the end of the last video, I said that we would be talking about three types of quasi-experiments, or three types of quasi-experimental research in this lecture: developmental studies, ex post facto studies, and non-equivalent groups designs. In this section of the video, we're going to talk about the first type of quasi-experimental research, which is developmental research. Developmental research is research that's done in the area of developmental psychology, which is an entire area of psychology. Developmental research focuses on how people change across time and how people stay the same across time. So developmental research focuses on both change and stability. There are different types of developmental research, and today I want us to cover three types of developmental research. The three types of developmental research I want us to cover today are longitudinal, cross-sectional, and cross-sequential research. So we'll go over the definitions one at a time, and I'll share at least one example of each. So longitudinal research is research in which a single group of people is followed across time. So an example of a longitudinal study might be a study in which the researcher tracks the happiness of a group of people across a certain number of years. For example, if a researcher gave a happiness survey to a group of people at age 20, again at age 40, and again at age 60, and each person took the survey 3 times, that would be a longitudinal study. Now, the amount of time that the group is followed in a longitudinal study varies from one study to the next. It can be a short amount of time, like 6 months, or it can be a much longer amount of time, like 60 years. But it's common for groups to be followed for quite a while in longitudinal studies, especially in developmental research, because in developmental research, you want to track how people change across ages, and the ages that people compare in developmental psychology are quite wide. Developmental psychology focuses on the entire lifespan. So there are some longitudinal studies that last maybe 50 or even 60 years, as long as the participants are still alive. A cross-sectional study is a study in which separate groups of people are compared at one point in time. So an example of a cross-sectional study might be a study in which a researcher gives a happiness survey to a group of 20-year-olds, a separate group of 40-year-olds, and a separate group of 60-year-olds. And the researcher compares the happiness scores of those 3 groups of people. That would be a cross-sectional study. Notice how, in the example I just mentioned, the researcher is comparing the same 3 ages that the researcher was comparing in my longitudinal example. In my longitudinal example and in my cross-sectional example, the researcher is comparing 20, 40, and 60 years old. But the researcher is collecting data in different ways. And hopefully you can already see how a cross-sectional study is inferior in some ways to a longitudinal study. And we'll talk about that in just a little while. The third type of developmental study is a cross-sequential study. A cross-sequential study is a study in which separate groups of people are followed across time. So an example of a cross-sequential study might be a study in which a researcher finds a group of 20-year-olds and a group of 40-year-olds, gives them a survey, like maybe a happiness survey, and then the researcher waits a certain amount of time, like let's say 20 years, and the researcher brings the same 2 groups of people back and gives the 2 groups a survey again. That would be a cross-sequential study. I think it will become a little bit more clear once I show you some visual diagrams of these 3 types of research. So let's start with a longitudinal study. So a longitudinal study is a study, like I said, in which a single group is followed across time. In this longitudinal study, a group of people is taking a survey at age 20, age 30, and at age 40. So this survey that they're taking could be anything. It depends on what the researcher is tracking across time. If the researcher is looking at happiness, the researcher would be giving a happiness survey to this group 3 times. And if the researcher was tracking self-esteem, it would be a self-esteem survey. And like I said, a cross-sectional study happens at one point in time, and different age groups are compared at that point in time. So in this cross-sectional study, we might be collecting data from a group of maybe 120-year-olds, 130-year-olds, and maybe 140-year-olds, which would be a total of 300 people. It wouldn't have to be that number. I'm just throwing that number out there as a possibility. And I said that in a cross-sequential study, a researcher compares separate groups of people. In a cross-sequential study, a researcher follows separate groups of people across time. So notice how in this diagram, two separate groups of people, group 1 and group 2, are both being followed across time. Group 1 is being followed from time 1 to time 2, and group 2 is being followed from time 1 to time 2. So since separate groups are being followed across time, it is a cross-sequential study. And a cross-sequential study is really a combination of a longitudinal study and a cross-sectional study. It's halfway longitudinal and halfway cross-sectional because groups are being followed across time, just like in a longitudinal study, and groups are being compared at a single point in time, which is cross-sectional. So if I did this study and I compare group 1 and group 2 at time 1, the 20 and 30-year-olds at time 1, that comparison is cross-sectional. And if I compare group 1 at age 20 and group 1 at age 30, that comparison is longitudinal. So if I compare horizontally, it's cross-sectional. If I compare vertically, it's longitudinal. So it looks like in this cross-sequential study, the researcher is looking at 20-year-olds and 30-year-olds at time 1. Then the researcher is waiting 10 years and giving a survey to the same two groups of people, but now at age 30 and age 40, because it's 10 years later. So now let's talk about the pros and cons, or the advantages and disadvantages of these different types of research. And actually, I'm going to do that in the next section of this video.